I was surprised in writing my book, What Jesus Learned from Women, just how much the book grew beyond the size, the scale that I envisaged it would be. I'm really glad that it is the longest book I've written at this point. If nothing else, that avoids the possible pitfall that if I had written a slim volume that just gave a much less detailed overview of the subject, that people might have looked at it, sort of looked at it sideways and said, what did Jesus learn from women? Maybe not that much, right? There is a lot in there, but there's a lot in there that surprised me, right? Things that I never envisaged writing, discovering, thinking of when I started the project. There's a whole chapter that I didn't anticipate initially would be in the book, and that's the chapter about Joanna. And the reason is that although it's clear that she was an influential figure in the activity of Jesus, she was a supporter and a prominent figure in her time, it's such brief mentions that we don't really feel like we have enough to go on. Then I came across the suggestion that Joanna, mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, might be none other than Junia, mentioned in Paul's greetings at the end of his letter to the Romans. Initially, I was disinclined to take that possibility too seriously. It seemed too speculative to begin with, but also there's been such a history of people combining women in the Gospels, sometimes with the express aim of denigrating them. Right? Think of the way that Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, and the so-called sinful woman, right, from the Gospel of Luke, all get rolled into one. The identification of women by male readers has sometimes reduced the number of women in the story, and in doing that has reduced their prominence, their influence, their importance. And so I didn't want to be part of that. But as I started looking into this further, and as I started pulling at the threads, so much suddenly began to make sense. To begin with, Paul says that Junia, together with Andronicus, are relatives of his who are in Christ before him and are prominent among the apostles. And however one understands that phrase, the description of Joanna in the Gospel of Luke fits that so well, right? And it would be surprising if none of the women who were involved in the movement around Jesus in his time ever showed up again in something like a letter. And so there's an inherent plausibility, and there's a precise fit in terms of the description. When we start digging further, then a number of connections start to come about. Things that you wouldn't think to draw, but when you start pulling on the threads of each, you find that they meet, right? Maybe you've never pulled on the threads of a sweater or a scarf and found that it was all one thread all along. Not recommending that you do that in order to see the illustration that I'm making here, but things sometimes are connected. And if we start pulling on threads and discover that they are connected and that a pattern emerges when we do so, that can often be historically important. And so just to give one example, if we think about the fact that Paul says he was of the tribe of Benjamin, right? The historic location of the tribe of Benjamin was in the region around Jericho, right, in that sort of area. And of course, Jericho and its vicinity are a place where Jews, Idumeans or Edomites, Nabateans intersected and interacted, right? That city and that area served as a gateway between Arabia and Palestine. And it wouldn't be surprising if somebody from the tribe of Benjamin, somebody from that region, ended up married to a Nabatean. And of course, Joanna is said to be the wife of Chuza, right, who was Herod's property manager or something like that. And his name is a Nabatean name, right? And Herod's family, right, had not just Jewish, but also Idumean and Nabatean connections. Paul, right, when we encounter him in his Gospels doing things, one of the first things that he does is, after he has his Damascus Road experience, according to Acts, is to go to Arabia, right? And in his letters he mentions going to Arabia as well. Why would he go to Arabia, right? We're not told. Why was he going to Damascus, where again there was a significant connection with the Nabateans. Do his family connections help shed light on this, right? Are they the reason? Was it possibly the fact that relatives of his were involved in the Jesus movement before him, something he explicitly says in Romans 16? Was that one of the reasons that he persecuted Christians? Sometimes we may dislike a movement, think it's a problem, think it's dangerous, but become much more adamant and active against it if members of our own family are taken in by it and are involved in it. It may be that looking closely at Joanna or Junia, exploring the possibility that they are the same person, this will unveil some things about the historical Jesus and the historical Paul that are important. Not to mention the fact that there may have been far fewer steps removed between the two during the activity of Jesus than historians have sometimes expected. There's a lot that we can learn about the early Christian movement, about Jesus, about Paul, by asking about the women who get such short mentions and whose stories would be told in much more detail if they had been men and not women living in a patriarchal age. Even so, I think we can do better justice to them, to their influence, their importance, and their stories than we have in the past.